Hey, Dog Nation, I'm Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented today by Engineered Solutions of Georgia, and glad to have you with us no matter how you get to us. A lot to do today on the program. Very interesting maneuvers in the SEC over the course of the last 24 hours. We will talk about that. Connor Riley will stop by for a Kroger Fresh Take. We will get into kind of everything that's been kind of out there with Georgia as of late, including Stafford Nick Williams leaving for Texas A&M, what that means for UGA, what that means for its recruiting efforts, kind of everything kind of built around that. Also, I'm going to kind of use that news as a way of kind of leading into the continuation of the series we've been talking about when it comes to those Georgia players that have chances to be first-round picks in this upcoming NFL draft. We'll look at defensive line today, and man, oh man, could this be a very interesting year for Georgia at the defensive line position. We will talk about all of that. In fact, it begins right now. DawgNation Daily, daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented by Engineered Solutions of Georgia, begins right now.
Today's episode of DawgNation Daily is brought to you by Engineered Solutions of Georgia. Dial 678-ESOG now for a solution to your foundation and waterproofing problems.
Presented by DawgNation.com, this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. Here's your host, Brandon Adams.
There is never a dull moment when it comes to the SEC, off-season, in-season, whatever else. This is, I mean, it's one of those things where, like, sometimes marketing messages really are true. You've heard it sit on the SEC network, the SEC's slogan, "It just means more." There are countless examples of that over and over again of how when it comes to a SEC football, it sort of just does mean more, or the SEC in general. There are stops pulled out in the SEC that you kind of don't see other places. Maybe an example of that here over the course of the last 24 hours or so, as Nick Williams, who is kind of a rising star in the coaching ranks, a guy that obviously played at Georgia and has been, I guess starts a graduate assistant, kind of moves on to that sort of analyst role at Georgia. Now he's leaving for a similar position there at Texas A&M. Williams putting this out on social media. He's going to A&M to become a defensive analyst. He had been working most recently kind of underneath Trey Scott, Georgia's defensive line coach. Williams kind of moving around there. And on the one hand, this is kind of good professional advice, right? If you're watching the way that Nick Williams has operated here, this is kind of how, if you were looking to get a big-time college job, this is kind of how you would do it. You kind of lean on, a school that you work your way up the ranks there. Obviously, right now, Georgia doesn't have any openings in its kind of on-field coaching spot. It's, leaning on sort of veteran presences there when it comes to that situation. So Williams says, okay, I'll go coach defensive line now, and I'll learn that spot. I move from defensive back over to defensive line, I'll learn that. And then maybe I'll go over to another SEC school and, kind of develop some new ties, some new networking relationships, all in the mindset of eventually that'll lead me to be what I want to be, one of those coveted 10 spots as an on-field coach somewhere in the SEC. That seems to be the way that Williams is going about this. So on the one hand, this is very much by the numbers for how you would move your way up the professional coaching ranks. But on the other hand, this is also one of those moves that has a way of feeling like the continuation of the never-ending SEC recruiting soap opera. Because as Jeff Sintel wrote at DawgNation.com yesterday, that this is more than just professional development for Williams. This is also a chance to maybe for A&M to kind of get back involved in a recruitment that it has been involved with and trying to be involved with for the entirety of the 2022 cycle. What Jeff Sintel writes for DawgNation, Williams, who's now on his way to Texas A&M, was heavily involved in the recruitment of several big-name defensive line prospects for Georgia in the 2022 cycle, Jeff Sintel says, including five-star defensive tackle Big Bear Alexander, who, of course, as a UGA commit. So on the one hand, this sort of looks like, hey, a guy that's just kind of trying to, work his way around the SEC, find that networking relationship that will eventually allow him to be an on-field coach. But on the other hand, this has the appearance of Texas A&M looking at one of their big in-state recruiting losses, Bear Alexander, UGA commit, and saying, what do we do to get back in this thing? What do we do to, try to make him, Alexander, reconsider A&M a little bit more? What if we go hire away one of the Georgia staffers who our DawgNation recruiting insider Jeff Sintel says that Alexander was pretty close with? Now, I think that's really interesting. Do I think that hiring Williams will steer Bear Alexander away from Georgia towards Texas A&M? I guess I probably don't. Now, I have said the entire time, and this is one of those things where, I guess my kind of, mindset as a young person kind of influenced by Larry Munson. A lot of you kind of remember, Munson as the former Georgia, play-by-play great, just like the voice of my childhood in so many ways. And one of the things that Munson was somewhat famous for was, his kind of pessimistic take on things. And, every team that Georgia was playing was the greatest team of all time. And every challenge was sort of this, insurmountable challenge. And those of us who grew up on Munson sort of grew up dealing with a lot of that kind of stuff. And so I guess I have a tendency to sort of see Georgia football sometimes through glasses colored by that kind of thing. And I've always felt like that Georgia holding on to Alexander was going to be a big challenge, even before you talk about, bringing a guy like Nick Williams over to Texas A&M, for the simple fact that we're talking about a big-time defensive line prospect from the state of Texas with these Texas programs, A&M obviously maybe most prominently included here, kind of trying to fight to get back in this thing. I've sort of never felt like it was over and done with Big Bear Alexander. I've always sort of felt like that this was going to be a recruitment that Georgia was going to have to continue to roll up its sleeves to win. I don't think that changes here, nor do I think the Williams thing sort of swings the balance of power in favor of the Aggies. It is just something worth watching here. A very interesting move by a program in Texas A&M that has all the money in the world and obviously choosing to use it right here. Now, could have Georgia matched it with Williams if they felt like it was the trump card? They clearly could have matched that money, and the fact that they chose not to maybe kind of tells you what you need to know about their feeling on this Bear Alexander recruitment or the Mikael Williams recruitment or any of the other recruitments that Nick Williams has been prominent in for Georgia. Smoke Dion Bowie there as well. So maybe Georgia still feels like it's in a pretty good place here. All I'm saying is this is just really interesting. Now, to kind of shift gears, but stay on a similar topic. So let's say in the light of the Nick Williams departure, you're saying, well, what does Georgia need to do to stay in the good graces of a guy like Alexander or other defensive line recruits that Williams may have been a big factor in? If Georgia's going to have to reboot its recruiting efforts, not able to lean on Williams anymore for some of this now that he's working at Texas A&M, what comes next? Now, I think it's fairly obvious, first of all, that Georgia has been recruiting at an incredibly high level at its defensive line positions for the last few recruiting cycles. I think that Georgia's defensive line coach, Trey Scott, is a star on the rise, both in terms of who he's brought into this program. Are you happy to have Jalen Carter? Are you happy to have Trayvon Walker? Are you happy to have some of these other guys we've seen matriculate into the program as of late? As a Georgia fan, you certainly are. Also for the development that's ongoing for some of these guys on the Georgia roster there as well. So if you want to stay, in the Bear Alexander business, the Mikael Williams business, or if you want to start thinking about like the Walter Nolans or the Travis Shaws or any of those big names that are out there, then obviously the next step for Georgia is to see big season this year for some of those Georgia defensive linemen who we have big expectations for. And if that happens, then listen, the recruiting for these Georgia defensive linemen is going to take care of itself. And really, this is kind of the continuation of where we've been on the show for the last few days. And just to kind of remind you, because this time of year, some people are kind of in and out. You maybe not get to hear every single word that I speak as much as that. As much as I'd love for that not to be true, maybe you're not always hanging on each and every word that comes out of my mouth over the course of the last couple of weeks. But in the aftermath of the NFL draft the other day, what we couldn't help but notice was the huge just correlation that seemed to exist between these teams that win national championships, Clemson in 2018, LSU in 2019, Alabama in 2020, and gigantic numbers, like a half dozen at least for each of the three teams that I just mentioned, either in the draft right after their national championship or the last couple of drafts since then. There's just a huge connection between winning a national championship and producing a bunch of first-round picks. So therefore, we said, listen, if you look at the Georgia roster and if you can't identify at least 6 guys who have the potential either now or in the future of being a first-round pick in the NFL draft, then you're probably not in the national championship business as much as you might like to be. So we've kind of run through all the positions. Last week we did offense. We talked about quarterback and JT Daniels and the multiple wide receivers you probably need to get there, the situation for Georgia at running back, the offensive line stuff. That was interesting from a Friday show, and I had a chance to kind of follow up on that with John Stinchcomb a little bit yesterday. And we shifted our gears to defense yesterday too. We said, listen, when you see a lot of these early look-aheads to the 2022 draft and all the conversations there, the name that you don't seem to see as much is a guy like Nakobe Dean. But I asked Georgia fans on yesterday's show, when you think about the best players in this Georgia defense, do you put Dean in a category lower than some of the other names that are more prominently featured in these kind of discussions? And I think the assumption I'll make is, and we all made on yesterday's show, is no. Dean is not someone that most Georgia fans have in a category below other Georgia players. There's a very chance that Dean is Georgia's best player. I mean, that's a threshold of possibility available for him this upcoming season. And so we kind of did that from the linebacker spot yesterday. Now on the defensive line, and appropriate to do this since we were just talking about Bear Alexander a moment ago. And this is maybe the most interesting position of all for Georgia because of just how good it can be. And in particular, right there in the center, the interior of that defensive line, the big defensive tackle, the nose man, Jordan Davis. The threshold of possible achievement that's available to Davis this year is, as many of you are aware, just off the charts. And it is so interesting to think about what could happen over the course of these next few months for Davis. In fact, let me give you just a quick example of this right now. Ryan Wilson, one of the mock drafters for CBSSports.com, already has his early look ahead to the 2022 draft, and he's got Davis as a first-round pick, has him going 29th overall. But it is what Wilson writes about Davis that's the most interesting here. Ryan Wilson for CBS Sports says of Jordan Davis in his 2022 mock draft that Davis is an enormous human being, we all know that to be true, who can clog running lanes all day long. We also know that to be true there as well. Let me just pause on this for one moment. Don't forget statistically how true this has been. When Davis first emerged for Georgia as a true freshman in 2018, Georgia was they're kind of average at stopping the run. Last 2 years, Georgia's been the best rushing defense nationally the last 2 years, and obviously Jordan Davis is a big part of that. But Ryan Davis goes on to say, we know he can stop the run. We know this big guy can clog the running lanes all day long, but Ryan Wilson adds a little more to this. Let me see some more from the Wilson quote, if you don't mind, when it comes to this. Wilson writing for CBSSports.com, but here's the but. Here's where Davis needs to improve. He says, we know he can stop the run, but Davis is going to need to expand his pass rush repertoire, mostly because he's only needed brute strength to beat most of the offensive linemen that he's lined up in front of. So Ryan Wilson, CBS Sports, who has Jordan Davis projected as the 29th pick in the 2022 upcoming NFL draft, says, we know he can stop the run. We know he's a giant dude who can use his brute strength to get past most people, but we're going to have to see a little bit more technique from him, a little bit more, quickness, if you want to start bringing that into the discussion to kind of match what you expect from a first-round pick defensive tackle. I think this is really, really interesting. If you go back and look at some recent comps for Davis in the SEC, we didn't have a defensive tackle, by the way, taken in the first round of the 2021 NFL draft. So you have to go back a couple of drafts to find guys who kind of match up with what Davis brings to the table here. There were two from the SEC in the 2020 NFL draft. There was Derek Brown, obviously, who left Auburn, Javon Kinlaw, who obviously left South Carolina. And if you look at the numbers those guys put up in their final seasons there playing in the SEC, you see a little bit of an idea for what Davis still needs to do to kind of provide what a guy like Ryan Wilson from CBS Sports says he's looking for. Derek Brown in his final season at Auburn had 4 sacks and 11.5 tackles for loss. That's pretty active back in the backfield. Same thing for a guy like Javon Kinlaw, who had 6 sacks and 6 tackles for loss in his final year there at South Carolina. You want to go back to the year prior to that, Quinnen Williams, leaving Alabama for the 2019 NFL draft, had 8 sacks and 19.5 tackles for loss. Now, that's a pretty amazing season. Maybe you don't count the Williams stuff quite so much just because that's pretty huge numbers. But certainly the Brown thing and the Kinlaw numbers, those are fairly, I think, standard goals for a guy like Davis as he moves into what's going to be his final season there at Georgia. Now, last year, injury-shortened season for Georgia, for Jordan Davis, a shorter season all the way around, just 1 tackle for loss, 1 sack for Davis in 2020. He spent some time injured. Go back to 2019, though, you see 2.5 sacks, 4.5 tackles for loss. So let's use that as a baseline for Davis right now. Can he find a way to get another couple sacks on top of that 2.5 number? Can he find a way to get another, couple, 3, 4 tackles for loss number on top of what he was already able to do in kind of a full season there in 2019? If he can, then obviously he puts himself in a position of making good on the prediction of a guy like Ryan Wilson that'll be a first-round pick. And by the way, if Davis can also do that as well, And then all of a sudden you're talking about guys like Bear Alexander and guys like any other defensive lineman you might want to mention watching very closely what's happening at UGA, as this program becomes just as well known for what it's doing at the defensive line position as it is for what it's been doing for a number of years at a lot of other position groups. My name's Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented today by Engineered Solutions of Georgia. And glad to have you with us, no matter how you get to us today, live on video, 10 a.m., Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, Twitch, radio at noon on Athens Sports Radio 960 The Ref, and as a podcast, wherever you find them, including the world-famous DawgNation.com. Just really happy to have you with us here today. And a big thanks to our friends at Engineered Solutions of Georgia for making it all possible. You know, ESOG, proud partner of UGA, makes them very fun to do business with. It's always good to support those who support UGA, and frankly, we're always appreciative of the way that you support those that support DawgNation Daily. ESOG been good friends of ours for a long time, and I love recommending them because I am a homeowner myself. And I know the angst that can be produced if you see that water creeping in somewhere, especially if it's basement or sometimes crawl space, garage, something along those lines. Or when you see those cracks that show up in the walls or the foundation or wherever else, you're like, is that supposed to be here? Is that normal? You know, well, the folks at Engineered Solutions of Georgia can answer that question for you. They can tell you if you've got a problem or not. And if it's a small fix, they'll give you the information you need to just go to the hardware store and get something. Or if it's a more substantial issue, then more reasons. That's why you should trust my friends at Engineered Solutions of Georgia. They have 2 full-time engineers on staff. They'll show up, they'll do great work for you. So very easy to get in touch with. Just remember this phone number. Call 678-ESOG now. That's right. Dial that number, 678-ESOG now. That'll get you in touch with Engineered Solutions of Georgia, proud partners of UGA, good friends of ours here on DawgNation Daily, and a great resource for you for any of your foundation and waterproofing issues. All right, we will get Connor Riley coming up in just a moment. A lot to do with Connor today. By the way, Connor took a little bit of a shot at me on Twitter. We'll talk about that coming up in a couple of minutes there as well, so it'll be fun with Connor as part of a Kroger Fresh Take here in just a moment. Before that, though, I want to go around the doghouse, and let me just briefly say this. I don't mean to belabor the defensive line point because I have other things I want to talk about. Let me briefly say this for a moment before we get there. In talking about Jordan Davis's numbers, as I just was a moment ago, and hey, can you add to those tackle for loss numbers to match what a Derek Brown or a Javon Kinlaw would have done in 2020? Or certainly what a Quinnen Williams would have done leaving Alabama after the 2018 season of the 2019 NFL Draft. If you are thinking about, Jordan Davis matching some of that kind of stuff, here's one thing to keep in mind. When Kirby Smart was talking earlier this spring about, pass rush and the need to replace an Azeez Ojulari and how do you do that? And obviously for a lot of the media folks, the question about that kind of gravitates towards the Nolan Smiths and the Adam Andersons, outside linebackers who now play a bigger role now that Ojulari is gone. But remember Kirby Smart on this, I don't have the audio to play for you on this today, but remember Kirby Smart on this, that he said, listen, don't forget about Trayvon Walker doing something like that there as well. So when you're thinking about defensive linemen who can emerge as potential first-round picks, obviously we talk a lot about Davis because he's being projected there right now. He's a year older. But keep Walker in mind on this, too, as someone who may have a chance to put a big sack total on the table because all of a sudden now he's getting a chance to do, as Smart said this spring, some of the things that Ojulari would have done a year ago. But also keep in mind that basic philosophy as well, that if Smart is saying, last year we were a good sack team, we got after the quarterback probably better than we had at any point in time in his tenure, Smart might say that. If that's what he's going to say about his pass rush and looking ahead to the 2021 season, kind of thinking, well, maybe some of the replication of what we've lost will be taken by the Georgia defensive line there, there's also a chance that benefits Jordan Davis a bit too. If Smart is saying those things about Trayvon Walker, then the idea that some of that could come Jordan Davis's way there as well, I think there's a chance that's true too. The point here in all of this is that this could really be a big-time coming-out party type year for the Georgia defensive line. The expectations are there for Davis. He's already being mocked as a first-round pick. Smart, though, back during the spring, bringing up a guy like Trayvon Walker, really unprompted, mentioning him when the question was about somebody else. I think it's all there. And that's before you get to a guy like Jalen Carter, who's obviously not draft eligible for the upcoming year, but one of those guys that just generates a lot of buzz around the program right now. I don't think there's any position group on the Georgia roster right now that's more fun to kind of think about and imagine possibilities for in that Georgia defensive line, this could be a really, really big year for that group. So I was going to do offensive line for the Around the Doghouse. I ended up doing some defensive line stuff there. I will just pick this conversation up with Connor Riley. But before I bring him on the program, let me remind you there is still time. Now, I have heard huge response to what we've been doing with the Atlanta Braves. Friday, May 21st, a really fun time to be there at Truist Park, the Battery, Atlanta, for our big event. Yeah, it all goes down Friday, May 21st. Thank you, Connor, for showing this to us here today. So many of you have signed up. Let me give you the details on this one more time here today, because I know a lot of you want to still get in on this opportunity while there's a chance and availability to do so. It's next Friday. It's May 21st. It's our DawgNation Days of Summer there at the Battery, Atlanta in the afternoon, rolling right into the Braves Pirates there that night. It's going to start at 4 p.m., a reception at the Terrapin Tap Room, the upstairs part there, which is just right next to Truist Park in the Battery. We're going to have dinner provided that night by Fox Brothers Barbecue. That's the in-house food there for the Terrapin Tap Room. Unbelievable Fox Brothers Barbecue meal. We're going to give you 3 tickets for some Terrapin beer there while we're there. We got DawgNation giveaways we're going to do that night. Some really cool stuff. I can promise you that. So we're going to give away some DawgNation stuff to everybody who shows up there. We're going to have a chance for you to win some Braves autographed baseball, future Braves tickets, gift cards from the Terrapin Tap Room, and everybody, me, a lot of the DawgNation team, all of you, we're all going to get lower-level diamond corner tickets for the Braves game there that night against the Pittsburgh Pirates. It's going to be an incredible time. We're all going to be sitting there together, and it's all just $77. This is a great deal for a fun night. We're going to do a meet and greet and Q&A before it for our reception there at 4 p.m., and a great time there watching the Braves there that night. It's braves.com/DawgNation. You see that there on your screen. Check this out, braves.com/DawgNation. Get your tickets there. Hit me up on Twitter. Let me know when you did, as so many of you already have. I can't wait to see you all there for a DawgNation Days of Summer event at Truist Park, the Battery, Atlanta, Friday, May 21st, braves.com/DawgNation. Please get your tickets while there's still availability on that. All right, a lot to do before we're done today. Fun edition of our program. Thanks for being here. Let's talk to Connor Riley right now, though, as a part of a Kroger Fresh Take.
From Athens and across the SEC or wherever the recruiting trail may lead, here's a DawgNation.com insider.
And we will say hello to Connor Riley, who has written a couple of very interesting things at DawgNation.com over the last couple of days, and I'm going to talk to him about all of that. My original plan was to ask my first question to Connor on the basis of what I was going to say as a lead into Connor, but I ended up going along on the defensive line stuff. So let me kind of set this up this way, and I'll bring Connor in on this. So yesterday we talked to John Stinchcomb about the situation with the Georgia offensive line, kind of going back to Friday's show where he talked about the role that the Georgia offensive line might play this year and, obviously boosting Georgia's national championship hopes. And I think it's been interesting the last couple of days, kind of marinating on some of this on the show. You have seen a little bit of praise out there for some Georgia offensive linemen. For instance, if you care about 2023 mock drafts, that's not next year's draft. That's the draft the year after that, which obviously going to be prone to error. But Warren McClendon shows up as a potential first-round pick 2 years from now, at least according, I think it's a Pro Football Network that had that. Mm-hmm. So 2 years from now, you're seeing McClendon earn some first-round buzz. Jamari Salyer has gotten some love as top 5 returning offensive lineman this year according to Pro Football Focus, which for me provides a little bit of a kind of a unique challenge of yesterday I mocked PFF for having Emory Jones a potential top 10 pick. So can I possibly kind of snidefully reject Jones as a top 10 pick, but then turn right around and praise their assessment of Jamari Salyer?
No, as someone who is pretty suspect of PFF and how they grade things out, you got to take the good with the bad.
Yeah, so I'm going to be a total hypocrite here if I laugh at PFF for what they said about Emory Jones, but use that same outlet as a way of saying, look how good Jamari Salyer is. But around here, we're expert communicators, so we'll find a way to do just that. But I've also seen some love out there for Justin Schaefer there as well. Some of the early look aheads to the upcoming season, he's kind of gotten some love there too. The point in all of this is I think, have been as loud a voice as anybody on this show saying I'm a little concerned about Georgia's offensive line going into the start of the season. Does any of the stuff that you've heard as of late cause you to change your mind about that at all?
No. That first game against Clemson, if Georgia loses, I have a pretty good feeling we're going to be talking about that offensive line coming out. Sure, I could certainly see the secondary playing a part, but Clemson, they're without their top 3 pass catchers from a season ago, whereas that defensive line has a very good case as being the best in the country with Brian Brzee, Tyler Davis, Miles Murphy, Xavier Thomas. I got so many 5-stars on that line. I'm not even bringing all of them up. So this offensive line, again, it's not a finished product. I don't think the starting 5 we see for game 1 is going to be the same starting 5 we see for game 13, potentially game 14 if you're a Georgia fan that is optimistic of a college football playoff berth. But this offensive line, again, Kirby said it's the area after the spring game where they've got to make the biggest leap forward, and I still don't know what that leap looks like or what that best 5 combination ends up looking like.
And I'm not surprised that you're not changing your mind. I'm kind of glad you didn't, because this is something we addressed on Friday's show, that if you look at the stats from a group like, say, Football Outsiders, and I do like some of the stuff they do because to me it makes a lot more sense. Last year on the basis of how they measure your offensive line in terms of helping the rushing attack out, Georgia was still, around that kind of top 10 number, what they call line yards, the first few yards of a running play that we would assume created because of how wide the hole is opened up. Georgia was like 11th in the country in that measurement a year ago. But pass blocking wise, and this is a very easy thing to understand, the percentage of times you give up a sack when your quarterback drops back to pass, Georgia was like 54th in that metric a year ago. So the one spot where you can kind of measurably look at in a way that even a doofus like me can understand, Georgia probably gave up too many sacks a year ago, at least to be kind of in that conversation of the nation's very best. And so while I am happy to see some of the Georgia guys earning some buzz, and while I guess I'm a little bit more optimistic, I guess bullish may be the better word to use, in terms of what I think the Georgia offensive line could still be this year, there is no doubt that statistically you can find an area in which if you're not good at that against Clemson, then you will be doing just a disappointing show on Monday talking about how you get back in the playoff conversation, because Clemson will absolutely beat a suspect offensive line.
Right, and with Georgia and specifically their pass blocking, yes, they can do some things differently offensively to sort of help that area out, get the ball out quicker, but Todd Monken wants to take deep vertical passing shots, and those plays just take time to develop. So you need guys who are going to be able to hold up in pass blocking. The way I sort of think about offensive line play, because I know PFF and Football Outsiders, they have a lot of numbers out there, but really – it's the famous line from, I believe, the 1973 Jacob Ellis versus Ohio Supreme Court case. I can't give you a definition of what good or bad offensive line play is. I just know it when I see it. And if JT Daniels is under constant pressure and Georgia is struggling to run the football, we're going to know we saw some pretty bad offensive line play in that first game against Clemson.
Well, one more quick follow-up of this, and then we'll change the subject. This is what John Stinchcomb said on our show last Monday. He said, because I asked him, I said, John, if I'm going to project a possible first-round year for JT Daniels, statistically, I'm capable of telling you almost exactly what that will look like. There's preponderance of evidence to point to that. Same thing with running backs, same thing with wide receivers. If I can actually draw up a stat line for a generic first-round pick at all those positions and come very, very close to hitting those numbers on the nose. I said for offensive line, it's a little bit harder to do. So I said, what is a great season for Salyer? And he said, it's not hearing his name sometimes, and it's certainly not having that TV broadcaster saying the name of the guy he's blocking over and over again. If it's all quiet on the Eastern Front, if he's playing, if it's all or Western Front maybe, if it's all if it's all quiet on whatever front Salyer's protecting for you, then you should probably assume that he's having a very good year.
Yeah, that's the thing. And we've talked about potential first-round picks. I expect Jamari to be a guy that gets mentioned for that. And of the offensive linemen, I would say probably he and Warren McClendon are the ones I feel most comfortable with, or at least solid in the sense that you're not going to hear their name a whole lot, but you might against Clemson just given what that defensive line has.
So this is sort of a classic SEC story when it comes to our Kroger Fresh Take here. Only down here would a guy who's not a coach at Georgia leaving to go to Texas A&M, where he's also not going to be a coach. Only in the SEC would something like this get sort of wall-to-wall coverage where everybody's kind of talking about, this, kind of over and over and over again and kind of dissecting every, specific detail of this. But in a way, Nick Williams leaving for Texas A&M at least has the potential of being something interesting and something worth talking about, right?
Yeah, I just want to pull up a graphic here from this morning. We're talking about BA's favorite team here and also the University of Georgia.
I tell you, I saw this on Twitter today, Connor essentially insinuating that A&M's my favorite team because I have kind of touted them as a team on the rise in the SEC West, and I do enjoy giving my hot takes about the rest of this league. But a lot of folks on Twitter, using Connor's tweet as a way of mocking me and making fun of me. I already get a lot of grief in our comment section because people think I talk too much about the Aggies, who I do think, by the way, could win the SEC West here this year. I'm certainly open to the possibility of selecting them as my pick to do so on that. So, Connor, thank you on Twitter for adding more to the grief I already get from people who think I talk about the Aggies too
I don't
much.
get a chance to talk all that much about A&M, and I figured they're your favorite non-Georgia team. I should clarify that there. And I know some people might not get sarcasm, but what A&M is doing is really interested me, and looking through what Jimbo Fisher is trying to build, and Jeff's point about Big Bear Alexander, I think, is a great one. If A&M, to me, wants to take that next step, they've got to start recruiting better, which sounds weird from a Jimbo Fisher-led team, but you go back and look at some of the recruiting rankings. His first class, they're 4th. That's where they need to consistently finish, in that top 5. Last 2 cycles, they finished 6th and 8th. Jimbo Fisher has gone out and he has made recruiting, I think especially with some of his recent hires, a bigger emphasis as they try to catch up and make up ground in Alabama, because they are they're very much like a 2018-2019 UGA right now, in the sense, in the way that they are trying to build themselves up and trying to play. They want to build along the lines of scrimmage and be a run-first team. They lose 4 offensive linemen from a year ago. They lose a couple defensive linemen from the draft. But they might have the best offensive lineman in the conference in Keon Green, and maybe the best defensive lineman in the conference, and I don't take that lightly, into Marvin Leal on that other side there. So it's really interesting, because essentially these two teams, I believe, are the two that are going to have the best opportunity to beat Alabama. I know you can mention LSU there. I want to see it from Ed Orgeron again, if whether or not 2019 is going to be a flash in the pan or not. And so now these two teams are essentially trying to figure out, hey, how do we beat Alabama? The problem that is obviously a problem for the rest of the country, but they have to deal with it first. A&M is pretty clearly trying to beef up its recruiting efforts to get better players so that it can help win there. Georgia doesn't have to worry about that because they've recruited so well, and so they are sort of going the schematic route, which Jimbo Fisher is a very well-regarded offensive mind, and what he has been able to draw and design up.
So this story is interesting to me on a number of fronts, because on the one hand, I talk about this a lot, where I like to see the areas in which there is no rule prohibiting something in college football, and the very best programs are always going to take advantage of those opportunities. Mm-hmm. For instance, you can't have more than 85 players. Yep. That's a rule that you can only do so much, to leverage against, because there is a cap on the number of players you can have on your roster. There's a cap on the number of coaches you can have on your roster. You can only have 10. But there's no limit to how much you can pay them. Yep. You can pay a lot of money to keep good ones in place. And when it comes to the analysts, the off-field guys, there's also not a lot of prohibition and stuff like that. So the best programs are going to kind of find a way to kind of use that to your advantage. And similarly, and if you listen regularly, you've heard me say this a lot, that when a program spends big on people as opposed to sometimes buildings, yep, spending big on people is always going to be the thing that has a chance to pay the most dividends for your program. So, in other words, if there's no rule against, I'm assuming that Nick Williams must be getting a pretty sizable raise to go to College Station. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, why would you make what is essentially a lateral move unless it was for a lot of money? If there's no rule against doing that, then a school like Texas A&M would be kind of crazy not to. And in Williams' case, if they're offering a bunch of money, he'd be crazy not to take it. I'm not saying I'm glad he's gone. I'm just saying go get your money. Get that bag, as the kids like to say. So my point is that this is A&M kind of doing what a program with a lot of money should do.
Yeah, and A&M has more money than anyone, as evidenced by Jimbo Fisher's massive contract they gave him to get him away from Florida State. I do wonder if maybe losing Williams is a little bit of a Will Muschamp tax, so to speak, in the sense that you bring him in as your analyst, and he is clearly a superstar analyst, is clearly helping out on the recruiting front, and he's making good change. I believe $300,000 to be an analyst. I don't know how much every analyst makes, but I imagine it's not that much. So I just wonder, Williams saying, hey, maybe I don't have a huge opportunity at Georgia this year. Go to a place like A&M where there are people he's familiar with, James Coley, Marshall Malchow, who's the former director of player personnel at Georgia, who's now using that same role at Texas A&M, and sort of continue to build up my resume in that way, because I absolutely believe Williams is going to be an on-field coach, and probably at Georgia in the near future, just given how well respected he is by recruits and by this coaching staff.
I think you're right about that. How about though the angle of this is a guy that had been working with Georgia in its defensive line capacity, kind of underneath Trey Scott there, obviously with a relationship with a guy like Bear Alexander, a recruitment that I already expected to remain contested throughout the end of this cycle. I'm guessing that Texas A&M thinks they're pretty cute by bringing in Williams clearly as a way of trying to get back in it with Bear Alexander. Now, simultaneous to this, my thought is if Georgia really thought this would swing the balance of power, then they would have paid him $1 million. They had to keep him it's like Georgia's not going to get beat, money whipped when it comes to, a situation like this. So my guess is Georgia doesn't think that the balance of power shifts with Williams' departure, but Texas A&M clearly is doing this with an eye towards recruiting in the 2022 class, almost for certain.
Yeah, you can't. What I said earlier about Jimbo Fisher, Big Bear Alexander is exactly the type of recruits Texas A&M needs to land every single cycle if they're going to get to a place where they can continually play against Georgia and Alabama. And if he still ends up going to Georgia, that's a pretty sizable L for Texas A&M. And I don't know if it's going to get talked about come National Signing Day, because if Alexander ends up signing, it'll have ended up being, this was a guy who was committed for a long time, committed on National Signing Day 2020, or I guess technically 2021. But that's a big recruiting loss for a program that pretty clearly can't afford many of those as it does try to catch up to Alabama.
Yeah, I mean, for me, and I very much expect Georgia to hold on to Alexander, but if and when it does, Connor, this is about as impressive a recruiting move as I've seen from Smart, and certainly from Trey Scott. If you go in and get 5-star defensive tackle from a place like Texas, that's a state you have no geographic advantage in. That's many hundreds of miles away. I mean, how many recruiting wins would have Georgia have gotten that were more, oh my gosh, I can't believe Georgia did that? Yeah, I mean, there wouldn't be a long list for me. Now, there's a lot of national recruiting wins, but a lot of these are in states where it's essentially fair game for everybody. This is Texas, where there's a huge home field advantage for the programs that recruit in that state. Georgia going in and getting Alexander is about as big a flex as Georgia's had.
Right. Clay Webb comes to mind. I know you can mention George Pickens, but Alabama was not in on him. Yeah. Alabama and Clemson were in on Clay Webb as far as going into enemy territory. You could say Cade Mays as well, and interestingly enough, neither of those guys has really had the careers that you would think that they would have, and Mays obviously ends up going back to Tennessee there. So those two names probably jump out, but A&M I think is a different animal, and Alexander in particular, because again we mentioned how Texas A&M wants to build along the lines of scrimmages. Alexander is just a monster defensive lineman and will probably end up being one of, if not the best defensive line prospect in this class, maybe only behind Walter Nolan there. So to me, that is something that where A&M absolutely knows that they cannot lose this guy, and Williams having a strong relationship with Alexander helps him parlay that into a nice analyst role there in Texas A&M.
I want to ask about the transfer portal here in a moment. You wrote something interesting about that yesterday. Let me remind folks, though, before we get to that, this is our Kroger Fresh Take with Connor Riley here today. And, of course, Kroger got you covered as we start heading towards graduation. I enjoy this time of year when you start seeing those signs pop up around all the neighborhoods and obviously, graduation parties, things like that. You start seeing some of this on your social media there as well. I'm hopelessly nostalgic and just kind of sentimental, and so graduation kind of always brings that up for me. Well, for those of you who are celebrating a graduate this year, and so thankful that many of these celebrations this year are going to be a lot better than they were maybe a year ago for all of that, Kroger's got you covered. You can order platters for the big party, flowers, balloons as a way of celebrating, the perfect gift card, greeting card, whatever else. It's all getting ready for graduations. Kroger.com/graduation for more on that. Kroger.com/graduation. They'll get you covered on that today. So you wrote an interesting piece yesterday, Connor, about Henry To'oTo'o, the former Tennessee linebacker now on his way to Alabama, and what the big bold move for Alabama, bringing in a name that a lot of SEC fans, most plugged-in SEC fans, were pretty aware of To'oTo'o, what he was doing there in Knoxville, now being there in Tuscaloosa. And you think there's a potential takeaway here for Georgia there as well. For people who haven't read your Good Day UGA piece at DawgNation.com about that, set us up for that conversation here for a moment.
Yeah, so Alabama, I think, like Georgia, has operated under the, we'll take a transfer if he thinks he really helps us, but more often than not, we prefer to bring in high school recruits and guys who come up through that pipeline. And Alabama going out and bringing in a Tennessee player in Henry To'oTo'o signals to me that, hey, one, there is the expectation that the SEC is now going to change its transfer policy rule, because Alabama is absolutely not wasting a scholarship for someone who will not be able to help them this year. And two, it's fair game for them. And if you're a really good player, and granted To'oTo'o, obviously the whole situation blowing up at Tennessee, him having a past relationship with that Alabama staff, Alabama was the runner-up in his recruitment back in, I guess, the 2019 recruiting cycle. This is something that Georgia pretty clearly is going to have to adopt going forward as well, because Kirby Smart has, I think, been very conservative in terms of how he uses the portal, and to his credit, it has worked so far. Georgia continues to recruit very well, doesn't piss off a lot of people, if I can even say that on here, and really use the transfer portal very selectively. Obviously, they bring in Tyke Smith. And if the SEC is going to open things up, because I didn't get a chance to write this, but you think of a guy like Demetrius Robinson, who came from a Power 5 level, but for I would say the first couple of years really struggled with the physicality and speed in the SEC. If you're pulling dudes who've already had SEC playing experience, you don't have to worry about that. And so I'm not saying Kirby Smart needs to go turn some early young coach at say Georgia Tech where they Photoshop fans out of the picture or whatnot and try and bring in as many transfer recruits as you can. But he is going to, I think, if the SEC passes this, be a little bit more open to bringing in guys who have that SEC playing experience through the transfer portal.
Yeah, I think that on the practical level, you're right. For a school like Georgia, who oftentimes is going to kind of feel like, hey, we're just one player away. If we had perfect player at this so and so position, then the chances of being a national championship contender skyrocket up, then obviously not leveraging the transfer portal for that would be, it'd be foolish not to do that. I think practically speaking, you're correct. I guess, I don't know. I just don't see To'o going to Alabama as a good thing for the SEC and a good thing for college football, which I know is a different argument than what you're making. And this is where, some non-Georgia fans say I'm hypocritical about this. I totally admit that I am. If Georgia could have gotten, say, a Rick Gilbert for instance, I would have celebrated on this show for 3 weeks if Georgia had gotten him. But is it good for college football if, a guy like that's quickly bouncing from one school to the next because the grass is somewhere greener? I think, like in my head, I sort of know that's probably not a good thing. I said this yesterday. I know this seems like melodramatic, but I mean this. I think there's some Tennessee fans, when they see a player that they grew to love all of a sudden playing for their biggest rival the very next year, I think that's going to turn some people off to the idea of college football in general. They're just going to go hunting. They're going to find something else to do on their fall Saturdays. This is the kind of thing that makes some people less of a fan of the sport.
Yeah, and I'm not, To'o in specific is obviously very different than I think most examples, so to speak. Brenton Cox, I would probably say fits that box maybe a little bit more, where if he was eligible right away after going from Georgia to Florida because he had just gotten beaten out by other players, I think that makes you a little bit more, is this really a good thing? And that's certainly a fair question. I know in the past, the reason Kirby Smart hasn't been for that is because more often than not, schools like Georgia and Alabama, they're going to end up losing out because of this transfer portal and allowing players to transfer within the SEC, because you saw last year, Otis Reese and Cade Mays go from Georgia to Ole Miss and Tennessee, programs that are still within the SEC but clearly a step down from Georgia. And they go in and start making immediate impacts there. And, you wonder if Major Burns is going to do something similar there at LSU this coming year, if that's where he ultimately ends up, and that's where it's believed he is going to. And so, well, yeah, sure, landing Henry To'oTo'o is, it's a nice pelt on the wall for Alabama, so to speak. I don't think Henry To'oTo'o changes the championship outlook for Alabama all that much. They still need Bryce Young to be a really, really good player, retool that offensive line, and have some wide receivers there step up. So, yes, it's big, celebratory, or whatever, but again, I don't think this changes Alabama's fate. And to your point, and to Kirby's point, more often than not, schools like Georgia and Alabama are going to be hurt by this more so than being helped.
Well, so I disagree with that. I want to talk about that part in a moment, but let me kind of follow up on something else you just said before we get there. I think this is a much bigger story for Vols fans, seeing a guy they thought was their guy, recruiting when they celebrated, and they've fallen hard times, and the rules now just allow a guy to just go to a happier, better place, and just like that, he ends up playing for Alabama. I think this is worse for Tennessee than it is good for Alabama, because the truth is, whether it's To'oTo'o or somebody else, my assumption is Alabama's going to have a good, productive player in every one of their spots, whether it's a Tennessee transfer or a 5-star they recruited out of high school or whatever else. My assumption is Alabama will have good players at every position. It just so happens this happens to be a Tennessee transfer they may be utilizing. I think, though, I just think that's I don't know if demeaning is the word I'm looking for here, but it's just sort of it's going to hurt the morale of a program like Tennessee, fans of the Vols. And listen, Georgia fans love to see Tennessee fans, feeling demeaned and diminished. But it's got to hurt the morale of Tennessee fans to know, just like that, our best guy can go play against us the moment we kind of fall on hard times.
Well, yes, but don't you think this is also a little bit of an extreme example, just given how spectacularly everything blew up at Tennessee? And, like, if Jeremy Pruitt is still the head coach at Tennessee, which I know we've talked about before, if Jeremy Pruitt's still there, I believe Henry To'oTo'o is still there as well.
Could be. I mean, you may be right about that, and maybe this will end up feeling like more like an outsider, kind of outside the norm. And I certainly hope that's the case. As far as your point, though, that the portal ends up hurting a school like Bama or Georgia because of the level that it recruits more so than helps. Boy, I'm not quite so sure that's true either, because I mean, we said this at the time that you can make a big push to allow the immediate eligibility for the intra-conference transfers, and that all seems well and good when it's an Otis Reese leaving Georgia to go to a place like Ole Miss. That seems to the average person to kind of create more balance and parity within the SEC. But we said at the time that eventually this is just going to be another weapon that the programs like Alabama use to take good players off bad teams. We've seen this in sports forever, that somehow, some way, the good players get off the bad teams and they end up going to the better teams. And this, to me, is happening just as quick as I assumed that it would, that the transfer portal would be just another way for the rich to get richer, and the average player on the average roster sort of crossing his fingers and hoping he still has a spot to play next year.
Well, but has Georgia gotten richer off of this so far? Because you look at guys like Jermaine Johnson, Tyreek Stevenson, and I'll even include Cade Mays in there as well, guys who are starters and partial contributors going elsewhere to be legitimate star players. And I think you're going to see, especially from Georgia, a lot more of that.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it kind of circles back to the point that that I think you made to start all of this off is that maybe Georgia has been a little slower than some schools to like fully embrace this. But the moment they do, then I think that Georgia, I'm assuming, will be just as effective as recruiting transfer players as they are as recruiting high school players, right?
To me, it still remains to be seen if that's how Georgia wants to proceed going forward.
It is certainly a very interesting topic. Connor, great stuff at DawgNation.com. I'll invite everybody to go and read the stuff on the Nick Williams departure today, the stuff on the transfer portal from yesterday. Good Day UGA showing up there at DawgNation.com. Just some of the great content that Connor's got. Connor, thanks for being here as well as part of our Kroger Fresh Take.
Yep, as always, was a pleasure.
Let's take a look around the rest of the league. This is SEC Through.
So good stuff all the way around there from Connor Riley as part of our Kroger Fresh Take here on DawgNation Daily, presented by Engineered Solutions of Georgia. And, of course, Connor mocking me for my Texas A&M love, at least the perception of my Texas A&M love. As I say all the time, I need that in my life because, let's face it, you sit in a studio like this, you got the bright lights shining on you, microphone in front of you, a bunch of cameras. You know, someone of lesser character and integrity could become maybe a little bit conceited, big-headed about all the the stuff that goes on around you in a day like this, so or on a just a daily basis. So it's nice to have folks on social media or comment sections or whatever kind of bringing me back down to earth. I always need all that kind of stuff. So I'm happy that Connor contributes to that and happy that those of you do that as well. With that in mind, though, as we transition to our SEC Through, I will talk about Texas A&M just a little bit more because I think this is really interesting. So obviously many of you are now aware of the other day when Fisher, Jimbo, the A&M coach, goes on his rubber chicken booster club circuit and doing what coaches have been doing for decades, kind of gets in the room there and gets the crowd going. And as someone who's kind of spoken at events like this before, when you get the microphone in your hand and the crowd's cheering what you're saying, it does become very easy to, as they say in wrestling, cut a promo, where all of a sudden, you're just kind of feeding off the crowd and just getting, more and more amped up. The more and more amped up they get, it's very easy to want to do that. In a situation like this, coaches obviously included. And so Fisher talked about how that they weren't going to wait until Nick Saban was gone from Alabama to beat his behind. Fisher used a different word, but I'll clean it up for the family-friendly audience here. He said we're going to do that while Nick Saban's still the coach. We're essentially not going to have to wait. And everybody kind of cheered about that. There was a local reporter who was in the room with Fisher that day, kind of publicized what Jimbo had said. All of a sudden it becomes big news. You had other SEC coaches responding to this. The other day, Nick Saban was on video. He had a very funny response upon hearing this, and a lot of folks kind of had some fun with that. So this has been a big story, the back and forth between Jimbo Fisher and what he said about Alabama, even though it's what coaches have done in the past. There is no local stories anymore. Everything goes viral pretty quick. And so the other day, Jimbo Fisher's doing a local radio interview for a station, I believe it was in Austin, and he was asked if he wanted to back off or kind of walk back some of the initial comments that he made. And Fisher didn't back down from it. He said, yeah, what else do we want to do? Of course we want to go out there. Of course we want to beat Nick Saban, Alabama, and that's exactly what we expect to do. So I guess in a roundabout way, I'm actually somewhat impressed that Fisher, knowing that the media now is treating this as bulletin board material for Alabama, it's kind of not backing down from this. I think this is really fun. We obviously don't get enough of this in college football sometimes, where big coaches do have some fun back and forth with each other. Obviously, Kirby Smart goes way out of his way not to contribute to any of the kind of this stuff whatsoever, and I guess in a way that kind of benefits Georgia. But when coaches are willing to have some fun with this, the way that Fisher seems to be kind of buying into this, the way that Nick Saban didn't shy away from it the other day, I think that's just kind of fun for the rest of us in college football there as well. So good for Jimbo for not backing down from this, and good for the whole SEC for obviously what's going to be an anticipated matchup in the SEC West later on this season. I saw where 2023 quarterback Arch Manning has planned a series of visits upcoming. One of those apparently going to be the University of Georgia, according to some reporting there at 24/7 Sports. This is kind of interesting because, the Manning recruitment 2023 is going to be gigantic. Arch is obviously well known because of his last name, but certainly you get the impression that he is more than just his last name. This is one of those things that's almost like a story too perfect to be true, like, third generation Manning quarterback. This is Cooper Manning's son. Is it nephew? He'd be the nephew of both Peyton and Eli here. So this is the third generation Manning. I don't know that I would consider Georgia the leader in his recruitment, but obviously Kirby does have a relationship with the Manning family. You remember when Peyton Manning was speaking and doing some interview stuff back during that golf tournament, way back during the pandemic lockdown, like the first sporting event we had, when Peyton and Tiger and Phil Mickelson, Tom Brady were all doing their thing. Peyton was talking about Kirby Smart at one point in time in that, with the idea of wearing the Tiger Woods red or whatever else. So clearly the Mannings and Smart, kind of have a little bit of a relationship with each other. And obviously Georgia's kind of, one of the hats on the table, it would seem, for Arch Manning right now. And we'll see if it goes beyond that. We're only kind of just now getting into the real heat of the Arch Manning recruitment, and obviously Georgia stacked quarterbacks in recent years. But as we head more towards that 2023 cycle, this is going to be a big one all the way around. By the way, speaking of big ones, saw where former Georgia coach Mark Richt is touting for the possibility of a 32-team playoff. It seems like a lot of playoff. I mean, listen, I like college football as much as the next guy, and obviously would want more of it. To me, more college football is always better than less. But a 32-team playoff seems to be a pretty bloated playoff all the way around. But kind of an interesting idea from Rick out there on that. And then finally, a follow-up to a story that we briefly mentioned yesterday. I use story in air quotes. So we talked about on late Sunday night, and I said this to you yesterday, that normally I'm not awake Sundays at midnight. I just happened to be this past Sunday because I'd been at the Braves game. So I come home and I'm just, you're checking your phone to see what you've missed while you've been, kind of away doing something with your family. And you see Justin Ross trending on Twitter, and there's these transfer rumors out there. And I told you yesterday that I'm trying to find the genesis of all this. What is the patient zero for the Justin Ross transfer rumor? And the best I could tell, there wasn't any kind of source material for this. This was one of those things that seemed to be almost like artificial intelligence, sort of went viral, almost like bots had created this virality of the Justin Ross transfer rumor. There was literally seemingly no source material whatsoever. Well, Justin, the Clemson wide receiver, has come out to correct the record here, jokingly saying on Twitter himself that it must have been a slow news day, that no, he has no plans to transfer. So Ross, the big-time receiver, who's obviously dealt with some medical, stuff there at Clemson, but also coming back here on the heels of a huge freshman season in 2018, is kind of prominently mentioned as a possible first-round pick as he returns to Clemson here for 2021. And obviously, one of the big names to know on the other side of Georgia's big season opener against the Tigers in Charlotte. Ross, who was the subject of some recruiting rumors over the weekend, says no, those are not true, and we'll make that your SEC through. And as we wrap up here today, let me remind you can be a part of our Gator Hater Roll Call by hitting me up on Twitter at DawgNation Daily. Share with me your Gator hating credentials, and you could be the winner of our golden shoe, which we give out each and every day. In fact, we've got one to give out today. Pretty funny stuff. A clever edit being shared here. We'll show this to you on the screen as a part of our golden shoe here today. This is, I think it's Dej Paget 92, if I'm saying that right. Maybe it's DJ Paget 92 shares somebody trying to get a tattoo showing up the Gator logo to be tattooed on the back, but it's actually a toilet that gets tattooed on the back instead of the Gator here. Very clever edit from someone shared with us there by DJ Paget or Dej Paget. You are the winner of our golden shoe here today. Always a very funny thing to be able to see. And speaking of those lousy, stinking Gators, Georgia goes back to Jacksonville 172 days from right now. That is our Gator Hater Countdown. We'll see you tomorrow on DawgNation Daily, presented by Engineered Solutions of Georgia. And on video, time now for our R.S. Andrews Cooldown. R.S. Andrews, the one to know, the one to trust for your air conditioning, heating, plumbing, electric needs. You can find them on time for the work that's promised, the price is promised. That is what R.S. Andrews will do for you. The R.S., by the way, stands for rapid service. All right. Let's go to Facebook first, especially since all of our Facebook audience is probably about to get put in Facebook jail. Connor, did you know that Facebook is now limiting the number of comments that you can make during the broadcast? So we've had, excuse me, hold on one second. Well-known Facebook commenters have literally had their accounts suspended. They've moved over to YouTube, which for them is a little bit like, crossing some, a horrible barrier.
Just come on over to YouTube, people. It's the way to go. It's the future.
Maybe it is, but a lot of disappointed folks on the Facebook side here right now. Randy Hall says start with Facebook, and I indeed am. Easy Brown says, "How about a 32-team playoff with a losers bracket?" That's pretty interesting stuff. Doug Rayburn says, anybody watching the FCS championship on Saturday? I have not watched as much FCS football as I thought I would watch here this spring. I mean, not to sound, self-important, but I'm just always doing something, coaching baseball or whatever else, taking a break from coaching baseball. So Sam Houston State is in the title game, is that right? And are they playing North Dakota State? South Dakota State. So South Dakota State and Sam Houston State. I assume that I'd be watching FCS football every single week, and I just haven't ended up doing it. So championship game, maybe I will check that out. Let's see what else. Philip Jordan Wells, good to see him commenting as always. Isaac Cruz says he loves my A&M shirt today. By no means, Isaac. There'll be no maroon on this body. No maroon on this body. Although I have kind of thought about this, and this is deep in the weeds. So one of the things that we can't really do on this show is we can't show red. For whatever reason, red just does not show up. So if you ever notice, like we ever use anything that's red, it comes out pink because we have a ton of lights. And we're getting ready to do a little bit of a studio redesign. And so I've been thinking about this stuff a little bit. If you don't have lights in the studio, then you can't see me. It just looks really weird. So to get me, and trust me, making me look presentable on camera is an all-day job as it is. But to get, just to make the screen look normal to your eyes, you have to have a bunch of lights. I got huge lights all in front of me. And so the reason why we go with blue in the background is because for the most part, blue matches the sponsors pretty well usually, but also because blue, for whatever reason, will show up on screen, whereas red just does not. So one of the things I have thought about is, and this is going a long way to make a small point, is since the red shows up as pink, what if we, for when we wanted to use a more Georgia red, what if we made it a little bit more of like an Alabama crimson or a Arkansas type crimson, probably not a full blown Mississippi State or Texas A&M maroon. I'm looking at my helmets over here from my SEC network set. If we went like kind of like a deep crimson, almost like a maroon, burgundy maybe is the word I'm looking for, would that show up as a more normal red when the lights popped on it? And that's one of those things you kind of think about from time to time. Like it would look burgundy to us in here, but it might look red to you because the light washes it out so much. So that's a long way to make a short point. But yes, I will always wear Georgia red. Will not wear maroon unless I need to make it look red on camera. Bruce Eklund says too much color talk for the colorblind. Bruce, I'm right there with you. So I did give out the golden shoe yesterday for the people who got Jeff Collins to delete the stadium tweet, and Connor mentioned that on the regular show a moment ago, but I was like really kind of sad that I had to sit that whole thing out. In other words, like people were showing the Jeff Collins tweet of the stadium, and everybody was laughing about how the fact that they had gotten rid of the yellow and replaced the yellow with the red. But for someone like me, I couldn't tell the difference. Now, obviously, if I'm in a stadium that's filled with red, I can see that. But something about the picture, the color wasn't really showing up to my eyes because I'm colorblind. And so like everybody's having fun with the Collins tweet and getting him to delete it. But I was essentially a kind of a wallflower spectator to all of that, a non-participant just simply on the basis of the fact that I couldn't see the color. Let me also say this. We're going to talk about like the least SEC thing in the world. So what if Georgia fans are trolling you or, I guess ratioing you for the tweet? You still don't delete the thing. I mean, like Auburn got ratioed to the moon the other day for their recruiting graphic thing, but that doesn't matter. Like, they're not going to delete it. I mean, SEC fans ratio each other's tweets all the time. It's just kind of what you do. The fact that Collins got worried about that, or somebody that runs his account got worried about that and deleted that tweet, that just shows you how life is over in the ACC. I mean, you throw one or two elbows over there, and all of a sudden they're getting real nervous and anxious and deleting stuff. It's a lot different than over in the SEC. Let's see what else. Georgia and Olive says we need to color correct. Maybe that's the case. Maybe that's the case. All right, let's see what else. And I'm going to go to YouTube after this. Bob Hayes hoping that we can make it back up to the mountains of North Georgia at some point in time soon. Boy, Bob, I'd love to be able to do that. That'd be a lot of fun. All right, let's see what's going on YouTube for a moment. See how they're doing over there. Hope all of you are doing well, by the way. Crow King 123 says, I'm done arguing for now, but there's no telling what I've missed over here. HR picking stuff with maybe the upset of I had no idea that anyone would ever use the phrase feng shui on the YouTube comment section. But how about HR picking stuff, going big on that? Thomas Orzak asked a really good question. I think this is a very, very important point. Thomas says, will Georgia make the playoffs if it's 12-1 and lose to Alabama in the SEC championship game? And here's my answer to that. This, to me, is why the Clemson game week 1 is a lot more important than people are treating it as. There is this kind of common refrain about Georgia Clemson that, oh my gosh, it's great to get these two teams together, rivals who should be playing more often, two teams that could both win the national championship. What a great season opener. Of course, the actual winner probably doesn't matter that much because either team can still make the playoff. It's that last part that I disagree with. The idea that the stakes aren't very high, that somehow this is a glorified exhibition and the real important games for both Georgia and Clemson will begin after that week 1 game. For Georgia, as our commenter mentions here, if you can beat Clemson week 1, then run the table the rest of the way, all of a sudden you make a strong case for yourself to be a second SEC team in the college football playoff in the event that you do lose to Alabama in the SEC championship, which is obviously not to say that I'm conceding that title game to Alabama, but on paper, Alabama would be a point spread favorite. On the neutral field right now, it is at least a possibility that Georgia would lose that game to the Crimson Tide. But Georgia's chances of being in the playoff, if it beats Clemson, and of course everybody else there as well, would be pretty high. In fact, if you want to get your knives out, obviously, euphemistically speaking here for a moment, imagine this. Imagine Georgia beats Clemson, runs the table, loses the SEC title game. Clemson loses to Georgia, runs the table, wins the ACC title game. So at that point in time, you have a 12-1 Clemson who's ACC champion. You have a 12-1 Georgia who's SEC runner-up with a head-to-head win against Clemson. Is there any argument whatsoever? Now listen, the committee would try to find a way to do this probably. Certainly there'd be, SEC haters trying to do this. But would there be any argument whatsoever if you have the same record, the only difference is, Clemson losing to Georgia? How in the world could you put Clemson in over Georgia, even if Clemson is the ACC champion? This is where, good luck trying to validate the credibility of the playoff beyond that. If a 12-1 Georgia with a win against Clemson was excluded from the playoff as a SEC runner-up, while a ACC champion Clemson with the head-to-head loss versus Georgia made the playoff, at that point in time, you'd have a lot of Georgia fans who wonder if the college football playoff's even worth it. So I think the stakes are pretty high for Georgia Clemson for the very reason the commenter just mentioned. Let's see what else. Chad Williams says Clemson's down this year. Bama's rebuilding. This is Georgia's year. Very well could be. Very well could be. Sergeant AR-10 checks in to say that that 2020 LSU is going to be what we're going to see from Alabama in 2021. Boy, I like that. I like the sounds of that. Connor Graham says breakout player this year's Channing Tindall. Connor's very good. This Connor Graham, of course, Connor Riley maybe as well, but this Connor Graham is very good at giving us some very bold predictions. I love bold predictions in our comment section, and Connor is very good at giving these. And this one saying Channing Tindall is a breakout player, that is a very bold prediction. Watching him against Tennessee last year was something special. I do think Tindall's a good player, and I think that's a very interesting name. All right, let's see what else. Jordan Bowman, who is a Clemson fan, says Clemson is better top to bottom this year. Couldn't be more wrong. So Jordan jumping in there to tout for the Tigers. All right, let's see what else. Schuler Thomas says if Notre Dame got in last year, how would Georgia not make it in? Schuler, the one place that I think the committee has an obvious bias, though, is when it comes to the geographic balance that it seeks. It likes to have teams from the Midwest when it can. I mean, listen, college football has, now down here we don't think of it as a problem, but there are plenty of people who do think of it as a huge problem. College football has a gigantic geographic imbalance right now. Look at all the players that were drafted. There were, I think, 6 Georgians taken in the first round of the NFL draft, if I have that number correct. Obviously a bunch of Floridians, a bunch of Texans, regardless of where they went to school, the state from which the state where they lived. I mean, we just have participation rates plummeting in a lot of the Big Ten states. Minnesota as a for instance on that. Wisconsin as a for instance on that. Football is just not as big at the high school level in some of these Big Ten states as it used to be. And obviously what's happening out west is just its own entity all the way around. So when the committee can strike a blow for national balance, putting a team from the Midwest, especially if it's a big brand like Notre Dame, that's clearly what it's going to want to do. And if it can do something not to make, the SEC look like it's lapping the field over and over again, that's what it's going to do there as well. So, for instance, we have 2018, Kirk Herbstreit on ESPN television arguing emphatically that Georgia ought to get in the college football playoff even after losing a close game to Alabama, the SEC title game. That's just not something the committee is all that not something the committee is all that interested in. They'd much rather take a team from the Big 12 because it's just a different conference. That's an entire kind of swath of the country that's all of a sudden theoretically more interested in the playoff because some school from a state that's close to them is in there. Whereas there's a fear that if the playoff every year is Clemson, Alabama, and Georgia, then pretty soon the only people who are going to be watching it are people who live in these southeastern states. And so that's why a school like Notre Dame, I believe, gets the benefit of the doubt. I don't think that's some sort of large-scale conspiracy theory or anything like that. I think it's simply a matter of economics. The committee views national balance, national parity as incentive. They see the incentive there to do that, and therefore they're following in on that incentive. Foster Moss says, what do you think of Tim Tebow signing with the Jags at tight end? My guess is it'll still be hard for him to make the roster. I'm guessing that. Obviously it seems a little silly given how many years it's been since he's played in the NFL, but even though Tebow is a Gator, I'm not as anti-Tebow as some people are. I think it's really weird how much some people seem to hate Tebow. Now, listen, when he's wearing the blue and orange, I hate him as much as anybody else does. But beyond that, I think it's really weird how aggressively some people sort of argue against some of this kind of stuff when, Tebow's still clearly in great shape. He was playing professional sports, not as recently as, a little bit more than a year ago at the minor league baseball level. And you can say the minor league baseball thing was a joke. The fact of the matter is, for someone who had not been a trained baseball player, prior to that, he was hitting plenty of home runs and he was doing some things there at the plate. I mean, he's obviously an exceptional athlete. I don't think he'll make the Jags roster, but I don't. Believe it or not, given the fact that I'm such a Gatorade, I actually don't hate Tebow as much as some people do. It is really weird to think, though, that Tebow once won a playoff game as a starting quarterback in the NFL. That's a strange thing. Let's do a few more here on YouTube, and after that, we're going to get ready to go. Frank Patterson, very funny line. Crow King 123 talking about Lane Kiffin. So I think the SEC West coaching situation is fascinating right now. And because I'm still not – I still think that Ed Orgeron's running a great program at LSU. I think they're going to bounce back in a big way this year. Obviously, I have talked up Texas A&M as being a really good team. I think that Nick Saban, Alabama, clearly showed no signs of going anywhere right now. So it's a 7-team division. I just gave you 3 behemoths. Y'all know I like Sam Pittman at Arkansas. At a certain point in time, there's not room for everybody to be good. And so, therefore, I'm probably a little less high on a coach like Lane Kiffin than some of you are. Kiffin gets a lot of attention. Everybody seems to love him. For whatever reason, I don't think that Kiffin's ever been quite as good at, creating storylines on the field as he is at creating storylines off the field. So I'm not that big of a Kiffin guy in comparison to other people who clearly are. But getting a chance to work with Matt Corral this year is a chance for Kiffin to show what he's all about. There's no question about that. William Perry says, I'm all for Tebow playing sports and staying off TV. I just hate listening to Tebow. Yeah, I have never liked Tebow as an analyst. I always thought he'd be a bigger deal on TV than he's kind of turned out to be. He's just not. I don't know what it is. I thought Tebow had the potential of changing the game as a TV analyst, but as William says, I find him to be a little bit hard to watch for some reason. I don't know. Just a little too saccharine or something like that. Is that the word I'm looking for? Just there's not quite enough edge to Tebow's on TV persona, I don't quite think. Frank Patterson says, like him or not, Kiffin's one of the best play callers in the game, and I don't dispute that. Sergeant AR-10 says that JT Daniels will be SEC Offensive Player of the Year. Boy, that's fun to think about. It's certainly a possibility. Fun to think about and certainly a possibility. All right, let's get a few more comments over here on Facebook. I lost my Facebook feed for some reason. All right. Hold on, y'all. Apologize. Maybe I'm suspended from Facebook now. Here we go. Let's get a few more comments. Brandon Griffin. Yeah, listen, there are some Florida people who love Tim Tebow. No question about that. Steve Highland, going back to the Ed Orgeron quote from a couple of years ago where he really let Alabama have it in the post-game locker room celebration after the win in 2019. I always assumed that was a sanctioned intentional leak as a way of flexing. Well, Alabama got him back last year for sure. Matt Rukavina, by the way, back on Facebook. He says, yeah, Matt, we're seeing your comment right there. So it looks like you're back out of jail if you ever were in jail. Looks like you're back out of jail. Jermaine King, this is an interesting point. He says, once a player goes pro, I stop thinking about what college they went to. And so, for instance, he cites Al Horford. Says Horford, the former Gator, was his favorite Hawk. And I guess that is kind of true in the case of Horford. When he played for Atlanta, I didn't think much about him being a former Gator. I thought a lot about him not doing some of the hard work in the paint sometimes, but didn't think about him being a former Gator all that much. I think that's probably a pretty fair point there. That sometimes you do just sort of forget that over the course of time. And I would say that in a lot of ways, even though Tebow may be the most famous Gator ever, he has been famous enough for other stuff now that when I think of Tebow, being a former Florida guy is not really the first thing I think about. That's kind of interesting. Marshall Fleming says when the TV contract is up, there will be a 12-team playoff with the top 4 teams getting a first-round bye. Marshall, I guess I'm also kind of left to wonder if they may expand the playoff before the current TV contract is even up. If both sides wanted to rip it up and start it over again, they'd be free to do that. Bruce Eklund says Gators did not develop Tebow's sidearm Tim. Yeah, that is not a pretty throwing motion. I will certainly grant you that. Steve Highland also gives the possibility of Keely Ringo as a breakout player. If that is true, and it certainly could be, if that is true, Georgia could find themselves in great shape because to get a former 5-star prospect like that potentially breaking out the cornerback spot, a spot that most Georgia fans would say is among Georgia's most substantial needs, you could really be onto something there at that point in time. That is a really fun thing to think about. And that is our R.S. Andrews cool down here for today. Of course, you can find R.S. Andrews online at rsandrews.com for your air conditioning, heating, plumbing, and electric needs. You can also check out the Atlanta Journal-Constitution online at ajc.com. So interesting story. You've heard about this is kind of a strange thing to me, and we don't really get into stuff like this, but the hacking of the pipeline that has led a lot of people to think there's going to be this huge gas shortage. Well, according to the AJC, that the gas supply for the Atlanta area is not a problem yet, but I guess maybe it could be. This is a fascinating story, as I said before. This is not the kind of thing we get into around here, but they're certainly the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, a great resource for all of this. What happened with the pipeline, what that means for your availability of gasoline. Because I heard there were a lot of gas stations yesterday that had kind of run out of gas, but you never really know if this is because they truly have a gas shortage or if people sort of assumed it was going to be a shortage and therefore kind of create that. But anyway, you can read more about that Atlanta Journal-Constitution, AJC.com. Also, looks like there's about to be FDA authorization for vaccines for middle and high school students. You can check that out and think about all that kind of stuff. And Braves back tonight against Toronto, starting a big stretch of 10 home games over the course of the next 13 days. We're calling it May in the A around here. But obviously the AJC, good coverage of the Braves. And, of course, our big event on Friday, May 21st, going to be a big part of that there as well. Also, Braves making some roster moves to be aware of there, too. And a whole bunch of stuff. Good times celebrating nurses there as well. AJC.com, you can find out about the big celebration for Atlanta area medical professionals like our nurses who've done so much for our communities here over the course of the last year. It's all online, AJC.com. Make sure you check that out. Also, we'll see you back here tomorrow at 10 a.m. for DawgNation Daily, presented by Engineered Solutions of Georgia. We'll look forward to talking to you then, everybody. For more DawgNation videos, check out youtube.com/DawgNation.